You get that tattoo out of a cereal box, old-timer? The voice carried easily across the crowded diner, sharp enough to cut through the low hum of breakfast conversations and the clatter of coffee cups. A few heads turned. Most people ignored it. They had learned long ago that Fort Liberty produced young men with confidence to spare. Glenn Patterson looked up slowly from his coffee. At 81 years old, he moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had stopped wasting energy decades ago. His pale blue eyes settled on the man standing beside his booth. The younger man was built like a machine. Broad shoulders, close-cropped hair, the quiet intensity that seemed to follow certain military units wherever they went. Ethan Cutler, Delta Force. Though Glenn didn't know his name, he recognized the type immediately. Every generation produced them. Men who mistook confidence for wisdom and certainty for experience. Glenn glanced at the tattoo on his own forearm, then back at the younger man. The faded black symbol had blurred with age. Time and sun had worn away its sharp edges until it looked more like a forgotten sketch than anything meaningful. "It's just a tattoo," Glenn said. His voice was calm, gravelly, unhurried. That answer seemed to irritate Cutler more than if Glenn had argued. The younger operator laughed and turned toward his companion. "You hear that, Reyes? Just a tattoo." Marcus Reyes remained standing near the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand. Unlike Cutler, he wasn't smiling. His eyes drifted briefly toward the old man's arm before returning to his drink. "Leave it alone," he said quietly. Cutler ignored him. He stepped closer to the booth. "Funny thing is, I've spent my entire career around military insignia. Unit patches, team symbols, call signs. I've never seen that one before." Glenn returned his attention to his coffee. Steam curled lazily into the morning air. Outside the diner windows, sunlight reflected off parked trucks and military vehicles. "There's a lot of things you haven't seen," Glenn replied. The booth behind him went silent. A waitress carrying a pot of coffee slowed her pace. A retired couple near the window exchanged a glance. The words themselves weren't hostile, but there was something in the old man's tone. Something steady, unmovable. It felt less like an insult and more like a fact. Cutler folded his arms. "You know what I think?" Glenn didn't answer. "I think somebody wanted people to believe he was part of something special." The diner grew quieter. The sounds of silverware and conversation seemed to drift farther away. "Ethan," Reyes warned. But Cutler kept going. "I've seen guys do it before. Old stories. Old symbols. Everybody wants to be a hero once they get old." Glenn looked out the window. Beyond the parking lot, an American flag moved gently in the North Carolina breeze. For a long moment he said nothing. The silence stretched. It made Cutler visibly uncomfortable. "You don't have anything to say?" the operator asked. Glenn's eyes remained fixed outside. "No." The single word landed heavier than any argument could have. Across the room, Sarah Whitaker, the diner manager, stopped refilling a customer's mug. She had known Glenn for nearly 8 years. Every Tuesday, every Thursday, same booth, same coffee, same quiet smile. He always asked about her grandchildren, always left a generous tip. And in 8 years, she had never once heard him mention the military. Not once. Yet now she noticed something she had somehow never paid attention to before. It wasn't just the tattoo. It was the way Glenn carried himself. The way he seemed completely unaffected by the challenge standing over him. As if this moment wasn't new. As if he had seen it before. Many times. Cutler leaned forward slightly, studying the faded symbol. "Whatever that thing means," he said, "nobody recognizes it." For the first time, something shifted behind Glenn Patterson's eyes. Not anger. Not fear. Just the faintest shadow of a memory. A memory old enough to belong to another lifetime. He lowered his coffee cup carefully onto the table. Outside, the wind brushed against the flagpole. Inside, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath. The silence lingered for several seconds after Glenn set down his coffee cup. It was not an uncomfortable silence for him. He had spent most of his life surrounded by it. Long stretches of waiting. Long stretches of listening. Long stretches where the smartest thing a man could do was say nothing at all. Ethan Cutler, however, seemed determined to fill every empty space in the room. He shook his head and let out a short laugh. "That is the problem with stories," he said. "People start believing their own legends." Glenn did not look at him. Outside, a delivery truck rolled slowly past the diner windows. Sunlight flashed across its chrome mirrors before disappearing again. The old veteran watched it pass as though it were far more interesting than the conversation happening beside him. That only made Cutler more irritated. Some people reacted to pressure. Some reacted to insults. Glenn Patterson reacted to neither. It was like trying to start a fight with a mountain. Sarah noticed it too. Standing behind the register, she watched the exchange carefully. Over the years, she had seen customers complain about food, argue over politics, and occasionally raise their voices over football games. Glenn had never participated in any of it. He always listened more than he spoke. Yet somehow his silence carried weight. You know, Cutler continued, every military symbol means something. Every patch, every insignia, every unit marking. Somebody can identify it. He pointed toward Glenn's forearm. But not that one. Several customers glanced toward the faded tattoo again. The symbol was simple. A black serpent forming a rough circle around a single star. Time had blurred the lines so badly that most people would have overlooked it entirely. Glenn finally shifted his gaze from the window. His eyes settled briefly on the symbol before returning to his coffee. Not everything was made to be recognized, he said quietly. The answer landed differently than Cutler expected. For a moment, the younger operator had no response. Marcus Reyes lowered his cup. Something about those words bothered him. Not because they sounded threatening. They did not. They sounded true. The distinction mattered. Cutler scoffed and leaned against the booth. Convenient answer. Glenn offered a small shrug. Maybe. Again, no argument. No defense. No explanation. The lack of resistance felt almost impossible to Cutler. He was accustomed to challenges. Accustomed to proving himself. Accustomed to people responding when he pushed. Glenn simply sat there as if none of it mattered. Near the front counter, Sarah quietly picked up her phone. She was not entirely sure why. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was the growing feeling that she was watching something she did not fully understand. Her thumb hovered over a contact she had not called in months. A retired Army sergeant named Frank Hollister. He sometimes came into the diner for lunch and seemed to know everyone connected to the base. Sarah glanced once more at Glenn. Then she typed a short message. Across the room, Cutler noticed none of it. His attention remained fixed on the old man. Tell me something, he said. If that tattoo means so much, why hide it? Glenn looked down at the faded symbol resting against weathered skin. For the briefest moment, his expression changed. A distant memory seemed to pass behind his eyes like a shadow crossing deep water. Because, he said softly, it was never meant for the people who stayed behind. The diner fell silent once more. Cutler straightened and crossed his arms, a smirk playing across his face as he tried to regain control of the conversation. You expect me to just take your word for it? He asked. Glenn Patterson did not look up. He continued stirring his coffee slowly, the spoon moving in a circular rhythm against the ceramic cup, unhurried, deliberate, entirely calm. The younger operator leaned closer, as if proximity would extract the truth from the old man. You could be lying, Cutler said. You could be trying to make us look foolish. Glenn lifted his eyes just enough to meet Cutler's gaze. They were steady, pale blue, with a depth that seemed to measure decades in seconds. I am not here to impress anyone, he said softly. I am here because I was asked to be. The words were simple. They carried no threat, no arrogance, yet their weight pressed against the room with invisible force. Marcus Reyes shifted in place, sensing the tension. He had been trained to notice small details, subtle shifts in energy, and this one was different. It was not about confrontation. It was about recognition, about understanding that the person across from him had seen more, experienced more, and carried burdens that nobody else could begin to comprehend. Cutler did not pause. A tattoo does not make a man a hero, he said, voice raising slightly. Glenn tilted his head toward the symbol on his forearm. Neither does it make him ordinary, he replied, voice calm, measured, gravelly, like a rock in a river smoothing everything around it with its presence. The words hung in the air, creating ripples. The diner fell into a quiet hum of conversation once more, but every ear had subconsciously tuned to the booth where Glenn sat. Sarah Whitaker behind the counter noticed the change immediately. Customers who had been scrolling through phones or talking quietly suddenly glanced toward the booth. The focus was subtle but undeniable. She felt it instinctively, the same way a nurse senses a shift in a crowded room. Sarah picked up her phone, thumb hovering over a contact. She typed a short message, concise, no explanation. Across the room, Cutler noticed the flicker in the old man's eyes, something almost imperceptible, but it was enough to unsettle him. If it means nothing to anyone here, Cutler continued, trying to regain authority, why carry it at all? Glenn's gaze shifted briefly to the faded ink, tracing the outline of the serpent, the circle, the star, the emblem that had outlasted wars, names, and time. Because it was meant for those who could never carry it themselves, he said. His words were calm, almost whispering, yet they resonated loudly in the minds of everyone present. Cutler opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His training, his confidence, all of it faltered in the presence of a man whose silence spoke more than any argument could. Marcus Reyes set down his cup slowly, not taking his eyes off Glenn. The subtlety of the old man's composure, the quiet authority in his presence, it was unlike anything he had been taught or experienced. He could feel the atmosphere shift, the room tilting imperceptibly. The casual laughter, the smirks, the brashness of youth, all diminished under the weight of invisible history, of unseen battles fought and remembered only by scars, by symbols, by memory. Sarah Whitaker exhaled softly, unnoticed. The message had been sent. The gears had begun turning, and no one in the diner yet knew how close the past was to entering the present. Cutler's eyes narrowed, a subtle tremor in the set of his jaw. Glenn sipped his coffee, not in haste, not in worry, only with the practiced calm of someone who had survived far longer than anyone in the room could imagine. Every action, every pause, every glance measured, deliberate, contained. The room felt different now. He was not just a man with a tattoo. He was a reminder that some things endured. Some truths waited patiently for recognition. The Delta operator's confidence was fading under the quiet pressure, the certainty of being in control dissolving like mist. For a moment, he understood only instinctively that the old man was more than appearances suggested, that the faded ink carried a story, a weight of loyalty, sacrifice, and experience. And still Glenn said nothing more. The silence continued, stretching, settling over the diner like a mantle. Not oppressive, not frightening, just undeniable, a quiet insistence that commanded attention without demand. Every eye, even those of the oblivious customers, felt the subtle shift in gravity. The unspoken declaration was clear. The moment required respect, not proof, and patience, not argument. The silence settled deeper across the diner. Even the coffee machine seemed quieter now. Ethan Cutler stared at Glenn Patterson for several long seconds before shaking his head. A faint smile returned to his face, but this time it looked forced. He was searching for a reaction and finding none. For a man accustomed to reading people, the old veteran was becoming an impossible puzzle. You know what? Cutler said. I think you enjoy this. Glenn raised an eyebrow. Enjoy what? The mystery, the vague answers, the dramatic silence. Glenn looked down at his coffee cup. Not particularly. Cutler let out a short laugh. Come on. You sit here talking in riddles and expect people not to ask questions. Glenn did not answer. The younger operator leaned forward again. His eyes drifted back toward the faded tattoo. The black serpent. The circle. The lone star. Time had worn away much of its detail, but the symbol still carried a strange gravity. I still think it means nothing, Cutler said. Nobody recognizes it. Nobody knows what it is. Glenn slowly turned his arm, studying the faded ink himself. His expression softened for the briefest moment. Not sadness, not nostalgia, something deeper, something older. That is because most of the people who knew it are gone. The words landed heavily. Around the diner, conversations faded again. Sarah Whitaker glanced toward the booth while pretending to organize receipts near the register. Her phone remained beside her. No response had come yet. Still, she felt certain she had done the right thing. Marcus Reyes folded his arms. The statement bothered him. Not because it sounded dramatic, because it sounded honest. Glenn had not exaggerated once since the conversation began. He had not bragged. He had not demanded respect. Everything about him suggested a man who preferred being forgotten. Cutler noticed the shift in the room and pressed harder. Then maybe it is time somebody forgot it completely. Before anyone could react, he reached toward Glenn's forearm. The motion was casual, dismissive, just a finger extended toward old faded ink. But the instant his hand brushed the tattoo, something changed. Glenn froze. Not physically, emotionally. His eyes remained open, fixed on the symbol. The diner vanished. The smell of coffee disappeared. The sunlight beyond the windows faded into memory. Suddenly he was young again, 23 years old, standing beneath a sky without stars. Humid air clung to everything. Rain dripped from broad leaves overhead. 5 men stood in a tight circle illuminated by the faint glow of a covered flashlight. No ranks, no speeches, no ceremony. Just 5 exhausted soldiers looking at one another after a mission that officially never existed. Someone held a crude drawing on a folded piece of paper. A serpent, a circle, a single star. Nobody smiled. Nobody celebrated. Yet each man nodded. A promise passed between them without needing words. A promise that whatever happened next, none of them would ever forget the others. The memory lasted only a heartbeat. Then it was gone. Glenn blinked. The diner returned. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air once more. The sunlight reflected across the front windows. Cutler pulled his hand back. He had noticed the change. Everyone had. It lasted less than a second, but something ancient had moved behind the old veteran's eyes. Something powerful. Something real. Glenn slowly lowered his gaze to the tattoo. His voice was barely above a whisper. Some promises survive longer than people do. Nobody spoke. Even Cutler had no immediate response. Across the diner, Sarah's phone suddenly vibrated against the countertop. A reply had arrived. Sarah stared at the message on her phone. Her expression changed immediately. The color seemed to drain from her face. She looked from the screen to Glenn Patterson and back again. The reply contained only a few words. Is he there right now? Do not let him leave. Sarah swallowed hard. In 8 years, she had never seen anyone react that way to the mention of Glenn's name. Across the diner, nobody noticed. The room remained trapped in the gravity of the old veteran's quiet words. Ethan Cutler shifted his weight and forced a chuckle. That is still not an explanation. Glenn looked at him calmly. It was never supposed to be. The younger operator shook his head. You keep talking like everything is some secret. Glenn rested one hand on the table. His weathered fingers brushed the edge of the coffee cup. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he spoke so quietly that everyone leaned in to hear. Some things stayed secret because they were supposed to. The statement hung in the air. Outside, a pickup truck rolled past the diner. The afternoon sun reflected off its windshield before disappearing. Inside, Glenn's eyes drifted back toward the tattoo. The faded symbol seemed almost alive beneath the soft light from the windows. Once again, the years slipped away. Not completely, just enough for memory to reach him. He remembered 5 men sitting beneath a canvas shelter while rain tapped steadily overhead. Nobody wore rank. Nobody used last names. The mission had ended days earlier, but none of them felt victorious. They sat together sharing silence instead of stories. A map rested on a wooden crate between them. Someone had drawn a serpent forming a circle around a single star. Crude lines. Uneven edges. Nothing impressive. Yet each man studied it with absolute seriousness. One by one they agreed. No paperwork. No ceremony. No speeches. Just a simple understanding. The symbol would belong to them and nobody else. It would represent something that could never appear in official records. Something too important to be forgotten and too complicated to explain. Glenn remembered the final promise. Not spoken aloud, just understood. If one survived, he would remember the others. The memory faded. The diner returned. The smell of coffee. The sound of dishes. The distant hum of traffic beyond the windows. Glenn blinked once. Marcus Reyes had been watching him closely. He noticed the subtle shift every time the tattoo entered the conversation. Not performance. Not nostalgia. Something deeper. The old man was not remembering a story. He was remembering people. That realization unsettled him more than anything Cutler had said. Who were they? Reyes asked quietly. The question surprised everyone, including Cutler. Glenn turned toward him. For the first time, a faint smile appeared. Small. Sad. Genuine. Good men, he said. The kind you never forget. Reyes nodded slowly. Somehow he believed him. Across the room, Sarah's phone vibrated again. Another message. This one was longer. Her eyes widened as she read it. Then she looked up sharply toward the front entrance of the diner. Somewhere many miles away, phones were already ringing. Conversations were being interrupted. Names were being repeated. And for the first time in decades, People in positions of authority were hearing the name Glenn Patterson and reacting as if a ghost had just walked back into the world. The message Sarah had received came from Frank Hollister, a retired Army sergeant who rarely sounded surprised by anything. Yet the words on her screen carried an urgency she had never seen from him before. Who exactly asked about Glenn Patterson? Sarah quickly typed back a reply. 30 seconds later, her phone rang. She stepped away from the counter and answered in a low voice. Frank did not waste time on greetings. Sarah, listen carefully, he said. Is Glenn still there? She glanced toward the booth. The old veteran sat exactly where he had been all morning, quietly holding his coffee cup, while two highly trained operators struggled to understand him. Yes, she answered. Do not let him leave. Frank's voice had changed. The easygoing tone she knew was gone. I need you to tell me everything that has happened. Across the diner, Ethan Cutler remained focused on Glenn. The younger operator could feel the atmosphere shifting, but he could not understand why. The old man had provided no proof, no credentials, no stories, nothing that should have carried weight. Yet somehow every answer seemed to make him more difficult to dismiss. Marcus Reyes noticed it too. He had spent years learning how to read situations, learning how to identify details others overlooked. And right now, every instinct told him that something important was happening beneath the surface. Glenn Patterson was not hiding behind mystery. He was simply refusing to explain himself. There was a difference. You said there were 5 of you, Reyes said carefully. Glenn nodded once. A long time ago. How many are left? The question hung in the air. Glenn looked out the window. Beyond the parking lot, the American flag continued moving gently in the afternoon breeze. For several seconds he did not answer. I do not know, he finally said. Life has a way of scattering people. The words sounded simple, yet something in his expression suggested a deeper meaning. Reyes studied him silently. Cutler folded his arms. You make it sound like some secret society. Glenn almost smiled. It was nothing like that. Then what was it? Glenn looked down at the tattoo. The faded serpent. The circle. The star. For a moment the years seemed to settle across his face. 5 men who made it home when they were never expected to. Nobody spoke after that. Even Cutler found himself without an immediate response. Meanwhile, miles away, Frank Hollister had already made another call. Then another. Names were exchanged. Questions were asked. Within minutes a conversation reached an active duty colonel. The colonel listened to a brief description. An elderly veteran. A faded tattoo. The name Glenn Patterson. The colonel stopped speaking for several seconds. Then he asked only one question. Are you absolutely certain? Back inside the diner, Glenn lifted his coffee cup again. His hands remained perfectly steady. The room had grown quieter than ever. Conversations had faded. Customers were pretending not to watch. Every eye drifted back toward the booth. And for the first time since the exchange had begun, Marcus Reyes felt something he rarely experienced. Unease. Not fear. Not concern. Respect. The kind that arrives before understanding. The kind that appears when history quietly walks into a room and sits down without announcing itself. More than 40 miles away, Colonel David Mercer stared at the photograph that had just appeared on his secure tablet. The image was grainy. An elderly man sitting in a diner booth. White hair. Weathered face. A faded tattoo visible on his forearm. Nothing about the picture should have commanded attention. Yet the colonel remained perfectly still. Where was this taken? He asked. The officer beside him answered immediately. 23 minutes ago, sir. Near Fort Liberty. Mercer continued staring at the image. Then he reached for a phone. Across the room, several staff officers watched his reaction with growing confusion. The colonel rarely interrupted meetings. Today he was already ending one. Get me General Richard Hale, Mercer said. Now. Back at the diner, Glenn Patterson remained seated quietly. The coffee in his cup had long since cooled. He did not seem to care. The old veteran sat comfortably within the silence while everyone around him struggled to understand it. Ethan Cutler was no longer smiling. The confidence remained, but it had changed shape. It was no longer certainty. It was curiosity fighting against pride. You keep saying things without explaining them, he said. Glenn nodded once. That happens when most of the story belongs to other people. Marcus Reyes looked toward the tattoo again. The faded serpent seemed insignificant. Yet somehow an entire chain of reactions had started because of it. Calls, messages, questions. The operator could feel unseen wheels turning somewhere beyond the diner walls. Sarah Whitaker's phone vibrated again. She glanced down. Another message from Frank Hollister. This one was shorter than the others. Much shorter. Her eyes widened. Is there a black pickup truck outside? Sarah carefully looked through the front windows. Parked across the street sat an older black truck she had not noticed before. Her stomach tightened. She typed a quick response. Seconds later, another message arrived. Then do not be surprised if important people start showing up. Sarah looked up sharply. Across the diner, Glenn seemed completely unaware of any of it. Or perhaps he was aware and simply unconcerned. It was difficult to tell. Outside, the afternoon sky had begun to soften toward evening. Long shadows stretched across the parking lot. Inside, the atmosphere continued changing. Customers who had originally planned to leave lingered near their tables. Meals sat unfinished. Coffee cups remained untouched. Nobody wanted to miss whatever came next. Even Ethan Cutler seemed to sense that the situation had moved beyond him. Let me ask you something, he said quietly. If this symbol means so much, why have I never heard of it? Glenn studied him for a moment. There was no hostility in his expression, only patience. Because the world hears about the missions that can be discussed, he said, not necessarily the ones that mattered most. The answer settled over the room. Nobody challenged it. Nobody laughed. Meanwhile, inside a secure conference room, General Richard Hale listened as Colonel Mercer finished speaking. The general's expression never changed. Not until one name was mentioned. Glenn Patterson. Then something remarkable happened. General Hale stood up so quickly that several officers around the table immediately fell silent. The room froze. The general's eyes remained fixed on the photograph displayed on the screen before him. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he reached for his uniform jacket. Cancel the rest of my schedule, he said. I am leaving immediately. The bell above the diner door jingled sharply before swinging back to rest. Every head in the room turned instinctively. Even Ethan Cutler, who had been attempting to maintain some semblance of control, froze mid-motion. The door opened wider than usual, and there, stepping into the soft afternoon light, was General Richard Hale. He was impeccably uniformed, for stars visible on his shoulders, the weight of decades of command moving with him as surely as his feet crossed the threshold. The diner seemed to hold its breath. The general paused, surveying the room with a quiet authority that required no announcement. His eyes scanned over the customers, the staff, and finally settled on the booth where Glenn Patterson sat. Glenn did not rise. He did not make a gesture. He merely watched the general approach with the calm of someone who had long anticipated this moment. Cutler opened his mouth to speak, but a subtle gesture from Marcus Reyes, a small shake of the head, kept him silent. General Hale stopped in front of the booth. He looked down at Glenn's forearm, eyes narrowing slightly at the faded symbol, the serpent forming a circle around a star. For several seconds, there was only the ambient noise of the diner, the quiet hiss of the coffee machine, the distant rumble of traffic, the soft scrape of silverware. Then, without a word, the general slowly rolled up his sleeve, revealing his own arm. The same tattoo, slightly more vibrant with age and care, but unmistakably identical. The gesture was deliberate, purposeful, a statement far stronger than any spoken explanation. Cutler's posture shifted. Confidence faltered. He blinked, realizing instantly the magnitude of what he had witnessed. Marcus Reyes remained still, but his jaw tightened as he processed the silent authority that had just entered the room. Glenn Patterson's hand remained on his coffee cup. He did not reach for the general. He did not nod. He simply allowed the recognition to pass between them silently. The room felt heavier. Customers held their breath, sensing something extraordinary but unable to define it. Even the clink of cutlery seemed muted. General Hale's gaze lifted from the tattoo to Glenn's face. There was no need for introductions, no need for explanations. Respect was conveyed through presence, through subtle acknowledgement. Ethan Cutler swallowed hard. The smirk, the bravado, the sense of superiority, all of it evaporated. He could not deny what his eyes had seen. Across the room, Sarah Whitaker leaned against the counter, quietly observing. Her fingers rested lightly on her phone. The sequence of messages, the calls, the subtle alerts, none of it mattered now. The weight of history, of unspoken commitments, of survival and honor, was condensed into the gesture of a sleeve being rolled up. For a fleeting moment, the entire diner existed outside of time, suspended between ordinary morning routines and the profound recognition of a life lived beyond common measure. Glenn Patterson sipped his coffee once, slowly, deliberately. Nothing more. And yet, that single sip seemed to punctuate the acknowledgement of decades of unrecorded service, of promises kept, and of respect earned silently, without proclamation or fanfare. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The entire diner remained frozen in the quiet aftermath of that simple gesture. General Richard Hale lowered his sleeve slowly and looked directly at Glenn Patterson. The years seemed to disappear between them. Not because either man had become younger, but because some bonds existed outside the reach of time. Ethan Cutler stood motionless beside the booth. Every assumption he had made that afternoon had collapsed without a single argument being spoken. He looked at the matching symbols, then at the four-star general standing before him, and finally at the elderly man he had dismissed as an ordinary retiree. The realization settled heavily on his shoulders. Glenn Patterson had never once asked for recognition. He had never defended himself. He had simply carried the truth quietly and allowed others to discover it on their own. General Hale finally spoke. His voice was calm, but every person in the diner listened. "There were 5 of us connected to that symbol," he said. The room remained silent. 5 men who came home carrying memories that never appeared in any report. Glenn lowered his eyes toward the coffee cup resting in his hands. The general continued. 3 are gone now. The words were simple, respectful, honest. Nobody interrupted. One disappeared from public life more than 30 years ago. He wanted nothing from anyone. No ceremonies, no speeches, no attention. A faint smile appeared on the general's face. That sounds familiar. A few customers exchanged glances. Sarah Whitaker felt her throat tighten. Marcus Reyes stood quietly with his arms folded, listening carefully. Ethan Cutler could not look away. General Hale rested a hand gently against the edge of the booth. The man sitting here today spent decades making sure the people we lost were remembered. Glenn shook his head slightly. We all did. The general nodded. Maybe, but you never stopped. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence was not awkward. It felt earned. Then something unexpected happened. Marcus Reyes straightened first. Not because anyone ordered him to. Not because protocol required it. He simply stood a little taller. Seconds later, Ethan Cutler did the same. Then another customer. Then another. One by one, people throughout the diner rose from their seats. Nobody spoke. Nobody explained why. The gesture spread naturally through the room until nearly everyone was standing. Glenn looked around, visibly uncomfortable with the attention. The general noticed and smiled. Some things never change. A faint laugh moved through the room before fading again. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the diner floor, casting long golden shadows beneath the tables. Outside, the American flag continued moving gently in the breeze. Inside, Glenn Patterson sat quietly among people who finally understood what they had been sensing all afternoon. Not fame, not power, not status. Something far rarer. Character, loyalty, memory. The kind built over a lifetime. After a while, Glenn finished the last sip of his coffee and set the cup down softly. The sound seemed to echo through the silence. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody needed to. Some stories were too important for applause. Some symbols were never meant to impress strangers. They existed for a simpler reason. To ensure that the people who mattered were never forgotten. And in that quiet diner, on an ordinary afternoon, everyone present finally understood the difference.